In 1954, on an August afternoon in North Carolina, Grandma didn't consult a woman's magazine. She stood over a stove serving up stewed cabbage, pickled vegetables, and a golden skillet of cornbread. Today, many of us couldn't put a lunch on the table that didn't come out of a plastic sleeve, a foil packet, or a drive-through window. In this video, we'll revisit 25 later summer dishes Grandma never skipped, but are slowly disappearing from our tables. Fresh black-eyed peas. In the blistering heat of a 1950s August, black-eyed peas were coming off the vine faster than anybody could shell them. They went into the pot the same day they were picked, simmered with a little pork for flavor, and served plain. Grandma didn't just cook to feed the family. She cooked to keep a roof over their heads and hope in their hearts. On the Southern table, the humble black-eyed pea was the ultimate symbol of humility and resilience. Long before corporate test kitchens started publishing precise recipes with shiny photographs, our grandmothers knew that a pot of peas simmering on the back eye of the stove was the baseline of survival. They were cheap to grow, easy to dry, and they filled a belly when money was tight. Grandma would drop a piece of salt pork into the pot, letting it render down until the broth was rich and savory. To a modern eye, it's just a simple bean, but to Grandma it was a reminder that no matter how lean the times got, the family would never go hungry. Collard greens. You could always tell how a Southern woman managed her household by the state of her greens. In mid-August, when the sun was baking the garden dirt to dust, collards were a lifeline of bitter, iron-rich nourishment. Grandma didn't need a modern cookbook to tell her how to clean them either. She'd wash them 3, 4, sometimes 5 times in a galvanized tub to get every speck of grit off the leaves. Then she'd tear them by hand, never with a knife, and slow simmer them until they were tender enough to melt. The real treasure was the pot liquor, that dark, seasoned broth left at the bottom of the pot. Grandma called it green gold, and pouring it over a piece of cornbread was better than any fancy restaurant meal. It was nutrition born out of necessity, long before vitamins came in a bottle. New sweet potatoes. Now, if there was one crop that bridged the gap between daily survival and a true kitchen luxury, it was the sweet potato. The first sweet potatoes dug from the hill in late summer were smaller and sweeter than the ones that came later in fall, and Grandma treated that first digging like an event worth noticing. In the 1950s, long before they were a marshmallow-topped holiday side dish, sweet potatoes were a staple of the late summer harvest. Grandma would bake them right in their jackets until the sugars caramelized and oozed out of the skin like hot honey. For a woman raised on thrift, nothing was ever wasted. Any leftover sweet potato was mashed up the next morning and mixed into biscuit dough or fried in a skillet with a little lard and sugar. It was Grandma's way of bringing a little bit of natural sweetness onto a table that had to work so hard for every single calorie. Cornbread. Now let's stop right here because we need to talk about the absolute law of the skillet crust. I want you to look at your TV screen right now and tell me, did your grandmother use yellow cornmeal or white? Drop it in the comments because back in the 50s, this choice was a serious matter. Back in Grandma's day, a Southern kitchen without a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet was simply unthinkable, and that skillet belonged to the cornbread. Now, Grandma's cornbread wasn't that sweet yellow cake-like stuff you found in the new northern box mixes of the era. To her, putting sugar in cornbread was practically a sin against heritage. Her recipe was strictly white cornmeal, buttermilk, bacon grease, and a pinch of soda, baked until the crust was dark, crunchy, and golden brown. Cornbread was the ultimate canvas for survival. It stretched a thin meal into a filling feast. It was meant to be crumbled into a glass of cold buttermilk for a late-night supper, or used to sop up the savory juices of field peas and greens. It was simple, honest food that tasted like home, long before the world got so complicated. Hoppin John. Rice on Grandma's table wasn't just a simple side dish. It was a revered culinary foundation, especially when stretched into Hoppin John. In the dead heat of August, when the pantry shelves were looking a little bare before the fall harvest, rice was the ultimate peacemaker in the kitchen. It took whatever scraps of meat or peas Grandma had on hand and multiplied them to feed a crowded table. She would steam it until every single grain stood proud and separate, never sticky and never mushy. Mixing that perfectly cooked rice with field peas and a smoky ham hock wasn't just a way to fill bellies. It was a tradition of stretching every penny until it cried. It proved that with a little time and a lot of love, the humblest ingredients could be turned into a meal fit for royalty. Stewed cabbage. Cabbage was another mid-August workhorse that Grandma relied on when the summer sun threatened to burn out the garden. While the glossy corporate cookbooks of the 50s were trying to push fancy gelatin salads and processed casseroles, Grandma stuck to what worked: a head of green cabbage, sliced thin and stewed slowly in a heavy pot. She'd render down a spoonful of bacon fat, toss in the cabbage, and let it wilt down until it was sweet, tender, and translucent. It didn't need fancy spices, just salt, black pepper, and a tiny splash of vinegar right at the end to wake up the flavors. Stewed cabbage was pure comfort food that filled the house with a rich, savory aroma, reminding everyone who sat at her table that elegance isn't bought at a store. It's created by hand at the stove. Fresh butter beans and limas. By the time mid-August rolled around, Grandma was already looking ahead to the coming winter, and that meant dealing with butter beans. Whether they were fresh from the vines or dried from the previous year's stash, these little beans were a cornerstone of Southern survival. Grandma would sit out on the porch in the shade, shelling them into a tin basin with a rhythmic ping, ping, ping. When it came to cooking them, she didn't follow any fancy modern instructions. She'd simmer those butter beans slowly with a good piece of streak-a-lean pork until the broth turned thick, milky, and naturally creamy. They were rich, hearty, and tasted like pure comfort. To Grandma, a jar of dried butter beans in the pantry was better than money in the bank. It was insurance that her family would be fed. Fresh apples. In the 1950s, the arrival of August meant the early apple crops were finally ready, and Grandma's kitchen smelled like absolute heaven. She didn't need a corporate box mix to make something spectacular. She would take those crisp, tart orchard apples, peel them with a worn paring knife, and stew them down in a cast-iron skillet with a little butter, a sprinkle of cinnamon, and whatever sugar she could spare. They would simmer until they were tender, glossy, and swimming in their own sweet syrup. These cooked apples were a bridge between a side dish and a true dessert. They might be served right alongside a piece of pork for dinner, or saved to be spooned over hot biscuits the next morning. It was a sweet, nostalgic luxury born directly from the backyard trees. Turnip greens with a bite. Now, we already talked about collards, but in Grandma's kitchen, you could never have too much of a good thing, which is why turnip and mustard greens had their own special place on the table. These greens carried a sharp, peppery bite that could wake up even the sleepiest appetite on a hot August afternoon. Grandma treated them with the utmost respect, boiling them down with a ham hock until that bitter edge turned into a deep, savory richness. She always said that a bowl of turnip greens was exactly what the body needed to cut through the heavy summer heat. Long before modern nutritionists started preaching about health foods, Grandma knew by pure instinct that these wild, spicy leaves kept her family strong, healthy, and rooted in the soil they walked on. Skipping them wasn't really an option at her table. You took a spoonful, whether you asked for it or not, and you said thank you while you did it. A small dish of pork. In Grandma's 1950s kitchen, meat wasn't something you piled high on a plate just because you could. Pork was treated as a precious gift, used with extreme care and absolute thrift. When she served a pork dish in the dead of August, it wasn't a massive roast or a thick steak. It was usually a small, deeply savory cut like side meat, fatback, or a few precious slices of cured ham. Grandma used pork primarily as a seasoning engine, letting its rich fats and smoky flavor carry the heavy lifting for the beans and potatoes. If she did fry up a few small chops, she'd stretch that meat by using the pan drippings to whip up a rich milk gravy to pour over hot biscuits. It was a beautiful lesson in gratitude, showing that a little bit of flavor could go a very long way. Field peas with snaps. August was peak shelling season, and nothing defined a late summer afternoon quite like a bushel basket of field peas sitting on the porch. Grandma would sit out there for hours, her fingers stained purple, breaking open the pods. But she never threw away the tender green outer pods of the younger peas. Those were the snaps, and Grandma would snap them into bite-sized pieces and toss them right into the pot with the shelled peas. Cooking field peas with snaps was an unwritten rule of texture and economy. The snaps absorbed the smoky pork broth differently than the peas, providing a bright, tender bite in every spoonful. It was a rustic, beautiful dish that corporate cookbooks just couldn't replicate because it required the one ingredient you couldn't buy at a store: time spent on a shaded porch. Sweet onions, a summer table essential. Now, while some winter kitchen rules say you should never serve an onion raw, mid-August changes all the laws of a southern table. When the summer heat hits its peak, Grandma knew that nothing paired better with a hot bowl of field peas and a slice of cornbread than a crisp, cold onion straight from the pantry. She would peel back those papery skins and slice a sweet white onion into thick, icy rings, setting them out on a saucer right next to the garden-fresh tomatoes. This is the ultimate taste of childhood. That sharp, juicy crunch was the perfect contrast to the warm, slow-simmered comfort of the rest of the meal. It wasn't about fancy prep or corporate cookbook instructions. It was just simple, honest food that made a hot summer day feel a little cooler. Corn beyond the cornbread. Now let me ask you a question. Did your grandmother ever make fried corn straight off the cob? Or did she use the dried corn from last year's crop? Drop a comment and let me know, because in the 1950s, corn was the undisputed king of the August table. Once corn came in heavy, it showed up in more than one form at supper, sometimes 2 or 3 in the same week. Corn pudding baked slow until it set. Fried corn cut straight off the cob into a hot skillet. Corn cooked down with a little milk and butter until it thickened up on its own without any flour to help it along. Grandma treated corn as the backbone of a late summer meal, not a side dish to overlook once the cornbread was already on the table. It was cheap, it was plentiful while it lasted, and it fed a family well without much fuss or much money spent. Whatever didn't get eaten that week went into the freezer for winter, cut fresh off the cob before it had the chance to turn starchy and lose the sweetness it had while it was young. A pot of plain white beans. White beans were a pantry staple. Grandma leaned on when the garden was between harvests or the week had simply run long with too much else to do. They didn't need much from her: salt, a little fat, and time on the back burner while she saw to everything else. She kept dried beans on hand year-round in a big tin on the shelf, and in the busiest stretch of late summer, when there wasn't time to cook something elaborate between the canning and the garden work, a pot of plain white beans filled in without a single complaint from anybody at the table. If they showed up 2 nights running, nobody minded. A good pot of white beans only got better the second night, once everything had a chance to sit and settle together. Cooked fruit. Now let's wake up your sweet tooth, because we are finally getting to the fruit. Think back to the smell of your childhood kitchen in August. Grandma would take the overripe peaches or blackberries that were too soft to eat fresh and cook them down in a deep skillet with sugar and butter. This wasn't a fancy, precise pie from a corporate baking book. This was a rustic, bubbling pan of stewed fruit, served warm right out of the cast iron. Grandma would spoon this sweet, sticky goodness over a hot biscuit for dinner or save it for a simple evening treat. It was the ultimate way to satisfy a craving for dessert using nothing but thrift, love, and the literal fruits of her hard summer labor. Whatever was left over after supper went into a jar for later, sealed up while it was still warm, and set on the counter to cool before it joined the rest of the shelf. The last jar from last summer. Now look closely at this next tradition, because it's a masterclass in vintage survival. By mid-August, Grandma's root cellar and pantry shelves were almost completely bare, waiting for the new fall harvest to be canned. But hidden in the very back was always one last precious mason jar from the year before, maybe pickled peaches, green beans, or sweet relish. Cracking open that last jar was a sacred summer ritual. It was a pattern interrupt in the daily menu, bringing a burst of fermented, tangy flavor to a table that had been eating fresh summer squash for weeks. It was Grandma's way of clearing the decks for the new harvest, proving that in her kitchen, absolutely nothing from God's earth was ever allowed to go to waste. Vinegar slaw and pickled vegetables. Late summer was pickling season in Grandma's kitchen, and something sharp, slaw, pickled beans, pickled beets, showed up at nearly every supper to cut through the richness of everything else on the table. She said a meal needed some bite to it, or it went flat on your tongue by the third bite. Pickling took planning that started well before the jars ever hit the stove. Vinegar, salt, spices measured by feel more than by any written recipe, jars boiled and sealed, then weeks of waiting before the first jar was ready to open and taste. If a jar didn't seal right, no satisfying pop once it cooled. She caught it fast by checking every lid the next morning. That jar got eaten that week instead of stored on the shelf with the rest. Leftovers from the night before. Nothing on a late summer table was ever entirely new. Something from the night before usually made it back onto the plate, worked into today's meal instead of thrown out to spoil in the heat. Grandma didn't believe in wasting food, especially not in a season when the garden was handing her more than anybody could keep up with fresh. What didn't get eaten got repurposed the next day, folded into a new dish rather than tossed in the trash. She'd fold yesterday's greens into today's beans without announcing it to anybody at the table. Nobody needed to know where it came from. It just tasted like supper, the same as everything else she served. Plain rice served on its own. Now, look closely at this next tradition, because we're coming back to rice, but this time it's standing entirely on its own. In the late summer, when resources were stretched thin before the big autumn harvest, a simple bowl of rice was the ultimate safety net. But as we know, Grandma never let anything stay truly plain. If there wasn't any rich chicken broth left to cook it in, she would mound that hot steamed rice into a bowl and top it with a generous pat of real creamery butter and a heavy dust of black pepper. For a special treat, she might even sprinkle a little sugar on top to make a poor man's rice pudding. It was a comforting, gentle dish that proved Grandma could create pure satisfaction out of nothing but a humble white grain. Greens served twice. Some families served greens at both lunch and supper during the busiest stretch of late summer. The same pot warmed back up the second time around without anybody thinking twice about it. Grandma didn't see this as settling for less. She saw it as plain good sense. Cooking a full pot once and eating from it twice saved real time during the weeks when there was canning to do, produce to pick, and no room left in the day for two separate meals cooked from scratch, morning and evening both. If someone grumbled about greens again at supper, she reminded them there were far worse things to eat twice in one day, and she was usually right about that too. A small sweet, never first. Dessert waited until the end, always without exception, no matter how good the peach cobbler smelled coming out of the oven while everybody was still finishing their beans and cornbread. The sweet was usually small. A slice of cobbler, a spoonful of stewed fruit, nothing elaborate or store-bought like a Jell-O mold from a magazine ad. It came after the beans, the greens, and the cornbread, never before them, no matter who asked. She believed you ate what fed you first and what pleased you second, and that order mattered to her more than most people at the table ever realized or thought to question. Nobody argued about it, not seriously anyway. The cobbler wasn't going anywhere, and everybody at that table had learned that lesson a long time before this particular supper. Bread saved, not finished. The bread basket at Grandma's table was never scraped clean. A slice or two stayed behind on purpose, set aside for the next meal instead of being eaten just because it happened to still be sitting there. She said finishing everything on the table felt wasteful in its own particular way, like you didn't trust there'd be enough again tomorrow. Better to leave a little behind and know exactly where it was headed next. Families who'd been through hard seasons learned to think this way without ever being told twice. And Grandma had carried that habit forward long after the hardest years were behind her. The leftover bread wasn't forgotten about. It showed up again at breakfast, toasted in a hot skillet with a little butter, and nobody at that table thought twice about eating it a second time. Something simmering all day. During canning season, there was almost always something on the back burner from morning until supper. A pot of beans, a pot of greens, something that didn't need watching every single minute of the afternoon. Grandma liked having one dish that took care of itself while she worked through the rest of the day's canning or garden chores out in the heat. It set the pace for the whole kitchen and the whole day around it. She rarely rushed a pot like that, not even on the busiest days. Good beans took exactly the time they took, and no amount of hurrying on her part was going to change that. One dish you didn't love: tomato bread pudding. Now, let's be completely honest for a moment. Not every single thing that came out of Grandma's kitchen was a crowd pleaser. I want you to head to the comments right now and tell me the one old-school dish you absolutely dreaded seeing on the table. For a lot of us growing up in the 50s, it was Grandma's late August tomato bread pudding. When the garden was overflowing with ripe tomatoes and the bread box had a stale loaf, Grandma would bake them together with sugar, butter, and spices. To her, it was a brilliant, thrifty dessert-style side dish. But to a kid, that warm, sweet, soggy bread texture was enough to make you run from the table. It's a funny, affectionate memory now, but back then, you had to choke down every single bite. The same meal, every late summer. More than anything else, the meal itself barely changed from one late summer to the next, year after year, garden after garden, all the way back further than anybody at the table could actually remember firsthand. Grandma didn't see the point in reinventing something that already worked as well as this did. Families who'd farmed the same land for generations understood that repetition wasn't a lack of imagination on her part. It was how you knew the season was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She set the table the same way every August, not because she couldn't have done otherwise, but because she didn't need to. It worked the last time and the time before that, and that was reason enough for her. None of these dishes were about anything mysterious. They were about a garden that didn't wait for anybody and a kitchen that knew exactly how to keep up with it, supper after supper, all the way through the hottest stretch of the year. Grandma didn't need a recipe card to remember what late summer required of her. She'd been doing it since she was a girl, standing on a stool at her own mother's stove, and her mother before that, back further than anybody bothered to write down. The work never really stopped in August. It just moved, from the garden to the porch, from the porch to the stove, and every August she set the table the same way. Not because the season demanded it of her, but because she knew exactly what to do with what it gave her, the same as she always had. Grandma's kitchen is gone now, but the love and wisdom she poured into every single dish remains. If these 25 rules brought back fond memories of your childhood, please subscribe to Nostalgia Calling and share your favorite kitchen memories in the comments below.